Picture this. It's a cold, grey January afternoon in London. The year is 1969. Office workers are typing away, shoppers are bustling through the streets of Savile Row, and policemen are directing traffic. Just another ordinary Thursday in the heart of the city. But then, something extraordinary happens. A sound begins to drift down from above. Electric guitars, drums, and four familiar voices. People stop in their tracks, looking up, confused. Is that live music coming from a rooftop? Yes. The Beatles, the biggest band in the world, are performing an unannounced concert on top of their own Apple Corps headquarters at 3 Savile Row. No tickets, no advertisements, no security barriers. Just four men, their instruments, and one of the most audacious performances in rock and roll history. This wasn't just any concert. It would be the Beatles' final public performance together. And nobody, not even the band themselves, fully realized they were witnessing the end of an era. To understand how the Beatles ended up on a rooftop, we need to rewind a few weeks. By January 1969, the Beatles were in trouble. The cracks that would eventually split them apart were already showing. The sessions for their White album the previous year had been tense. George Harrison had briefly quit the band. Relationships were strained. The magic that had defined them throughout the 60s seemed to be fading. Paul McCartney had an idea to bring them back together. He proposed a project called Get Back, a return to their roots. They would rehearse a bunch of songs, play them live, and film the whole process. It would be raw, honest, stripped down. No studio tricks, no overdubs, just four guys playing music the way they used to in Hamburg and Liverpool. The plan was to culminate in a live performance, their first in nearly 3 years, since their final concert at Candlestick Park in San Francisco in 1966. But where? They threw around wild ideas, an amphitheater in Libya, a cruise ship, even an asylum. Nothing felt right. The rehearsals at Twickenham Film Studios were miserable. The massive soundstage felt cold and impersonal. Cameras were rolling constantly. Arguments broke out. George Harrison quit again. Though this time he came back a few days later, things were falling apart. Then they moved to their new Apple studios in the basement of their Savile Row offices. The atmosphere improved slightly. They had their own space, their own equipment. Billy Preston, the talented keyboardist, joined them, adding fresh energy and helping to smooth tensions. But they still needed to decide on a venue for the concert. Time was running out, the month was nearly over. It was Paul who suggested the rooftop. Why go anywhere at all? They had a perfectly good roof right above them. The others were skeptical at first, but the idea had a certain charm. It was spontaneous, rebellious even, very Beatles. No grand venue, no elaborate staging, just them, playing for whoever happened to be passing by. It felt like a return to their busking days, playing on street corners for anyone who would listen. On the morning of January 30th, roadies hauled amplifiers, drums, and a small PA system up several flights of stairs to the flat roof of 3 Savile Row. It was freezing, a bitter London winter day with temperatures barely above freezing. The wind cut across the rooftop. This was going to be uncomfortable. But the Beatles had made their decision. At 12:30 p.m., they took their positions. John Lennon wore his girlfriend Yoko Ono's fur coat. Ringo Starr put on his wife Maureen's red raincoat. George Harrison wore a green coat. Paul tried to warm his fingers. Billy Preston settled behind his electric piano. The cameras rolled. And then, without any announcement or fanfare, they began to play. The set list was simple, mostly new songs they'd been working on during the Get Back sessions. They opened with Get Back, Paul's driving rocker, about going back to where you once belonged. The sound echoed across Savile Row and into the surrounding streets. Below, confusion reigned. Secretaries rushed to windows. Shoppers stopped and stared upward. Traffic began to slow. Some people smiled and started dancing on the sidewalks. Others looked annoyed. Who was making all this noise? The Beatles played through their new material. Don't let me down, John's passionate plea to Yoko. I've got a feeling, with Paul and John trading verses like old times. One After 909, a song they'd actually written back in the 50s, now getting its moment in the sun. Dig a Pony, another Lennon composition. The playing wasn't perfect. How could it be, in that cold, with numb fingers and wind-battered microphones? But there was something raw and real about it. These weren't the polished Beatles of Sgt. Pepper's era. These were four musicians, playing live, making mistakes, laughing between songs, just enjoying the moment. John made jokes between songs. Paul grinned as he sang. George's guitar work was understated but solid. And Ringo, wearing that bright red coat, kept the rhythm steady despite the cold. The crowd below grew larger. Office workers abandoned their desks. People poured out of nearby buildings. Some climbed onto adjacent rooftops to get a better view. The Daily Mirror's offices were directly across the street, and photographers rushed to capture the moment. But not everyone was pleased. Complaints started flooding into the local police station. Noise disturbance, public nuisance. The police began making their way to 3 Savile Row. About midway through the performance, police officers arrived at the Apple building. They made their way up the stairs, trying to figure out how to handle this situation. You couldn't exactly arrest the Beatles, could you? The band kept playing. They knew the police were there. You can see the awareness in the film footage, but they weren't about to stop. This might be their last chance to play together in public, and they were going to make it count. The officers were polite but firm. The music needed to stop. The complaints were piling up. This couldn't continue, but the Beatles played one more song and then another. They were stretching it out as long as they could. Finally, after performing for about 42 minutes, they played Get Back one more time. It felt like the right note to end on. A song about returning to your roots, about going back to where you once belonged.
And then came one of the most famous ad-libs in rock history. As the final notes faded, John Lennon stepped up to his microphone and said, "I'd like to say thank you on behalf of the group and ourselves, and I hope we passed the audition."
It was vintage Lennon, cheeky, self-deprecating, perfect. The Beatles auditioning after nearly a decade of changing the world. The irony was delicious. The music stopped, the rooftop fell silent. The Beatles packed up their instruments and headed downstairs, back into the warmth of the building. The police didn't arrest anyone. They took some names, filed a report, and left. The crowd below slowly dispersed, returning to their offices and shops, no doubt with an incredible story to tell. The footage from that day became the climax of the Let It Be film, released in 1970. The Get Back project, despite its troubled genesis, had produced something remarkable, a document of the Beatles in their final days as a performing band. But the rooftop concert couldn't save them. The tensions that had been building for years didn't disappear. Within months, the band would begin to fracture beyond repair. They'd record Abbey Road that summer, their final, magnificent statement, but they never performed together in public again. Paul would officially announce his departure in April 1970, effectively ending the Beatles. John, Paul, George and Ringo would all go on to successful solo careers, but they would never recapture that magic they'd had together. Looking back, the rooftop concert feels almost prophetic. Here were four men who had conquered the world, who had played to screaming crowds in the biggest venues on earth, choosing to end their live career in the most intimate, unpretentious way possible. Playing for free, for random passers-by, on a cold rooftop in London. It was guerrilla theatre. It was street performance art. It was the Beatles being the Beatles one last time. The impact of that 42-minute performance has echoed through the decades. Countless bands have cited it as an inspiration. The idea of the surprise concert, the pop-up performance, can be traced back to that January afternoon on Savile Row. In 2022, Peter Jackson's documentary series Get Back gave us new perspectives on those January sessions and the rooftop concert, using footage that had sat in archives for decades. We saw more of the joy, the camaraderie, the genuine affection these four men still had for each other, even as their partnership was ending. The building at 3 Savile Row still stands, and Beatles fans from around the world make pilgrimages there, looking up at that rooftop, imagining what it must have been like to be on the street that day, hearing those songs for the first time, drifting down from above. The Beatles Rooftop concert reminds us that the best moments in music, in art, in life, often come when we take risks, when we break the rules, when we do something spontaneous and genuine. It wasn't a perfect performance. It wasn't in a prestigious venue, but it was real, and it was magnificent, and it was the perfect way for the greatest band in the world to say goodbye. As John said, they passed the audition.